The medical reports were flawless. The ink was barely dry on a document that used words like unremarkable, clear, and normal. In the world of modern medicine, Sarah was a picture of perfect health. Her doctors were confident, their smiles practiced and reassuring. The scans showed nothing but healthy tissue, and the blood work betrayed no secrets. By every metric of the 21st century, Sarah was safe. But inside her quiet apartment, a different kind of diagnosis was happening, one that didn't rely on radiation or chemical reagents. Max, a rescue dog with a past as mottled as his toast-colored fur, wouldn't stop. It began as a curiosity, a lingering sniff at her side, but it quickly spiraled into a desperate, daily obsession. Every morning, before the sun had fully crested the horizon, Sarah would feel the damp, cold pressure of his nose against the left side of her chest. Every night, as she tried to drift into a peaceful sleep, she would hear the rhythmic, mournful sound of him crying softly beside her bed. This wasn't the standard affection of a pet. This wasn't a plea for a walk or a demand for a treat. This was urgency. At first, Sarah did what most of us would do. She laughed it off. We tell ourselves that dogs are eccentric creatures. They bark at shadows, they chase invisible squirrels, they fixate on things we cannot perceive. But as the weeks bled into a month, the quirk became a haunting. Max's behavior intensified into something physical and frantic. He began pawing at her, his blunt claws catching on her sweaters, trying to dig at a spot on her body that appeared perfectly healthy. He started blocking the front door when she tried to leave for work, his body a solid, trembling barricade. He looked at her with amber eyes that seemed to be screaming a warning she couldn't understand. He was trying to protect her from something only he could see, or more accurately, something only he could smell. Friends told her she was overthinking it. They told her Max was just sensitive or needy because of his time in the shelter. Even the professionals remained skeptical. During her initial checkup, Sarah mentioned the dog's behavior, only to be met with a polite, patronizing tilt of the head. "Dogs pick up on our stress, Sarah," the doctor had said. "He's probably just sensing your nerves." Everyone assured her she was fine. The world told her she was healthy. Everyone was in total agreement, except for the dog. And then came the day the world shifted on its axis. Driven by a nagging sense of dread that she couldn't justify to anyone but herself, Sarah demanded deeper testing. She stood her ground against the skepticism of the medical establishment, fueled only by the heartbreak in her dog's eyes. When the truth finally appeared on the high-definition monitor, the atmosphere in the room vanished. There it was, a tumor. It was early stage, microscopic, and buried so deep within the tissue that it was almost invisible to the naked eye. It was a stealth cancer, the kind that stays quiet until it's too late. It was easy to miss. It was deadly if ignored. In that moment, the doctor's voice changed instantly. The clinical detachment was replaced by a sharp, focused gravity. The room felt smaller. Sarah's future, which had seemed so certain just moments ago, was suddenly a vast, terrifying unknown. But as the shock settled over her like a cold shroud, the first emotion she felt wasn't actually fear. It was a profound, staggering sense of awe, because somehow, impossibly, her dog had known. Max had detected the fire while it was still just a spark. He had read the chemical signature of her survival long before the most expensive machines in the city caught the scent. This is not a work of fiction. This is not an urban legend or a miracle story designed merely to tug at your heartstrings. This is a real, documented phenomenon that is currently turning the world of oncology upside down. We are discovering that dogs possess an olfactory system so sophisticated it functions like a biological supercomputer, capable of detecting the volatile organic compounds released by malignant cells with an accuracy that rivals and sometimes surpasses our best medical equipment. At the center of this story is one ordinary rescue dog, a dog that nobody wanted, with an extraordinary instinct that refused to be silenced. Tonight, we are going into the heart of that journey. We will explore the incredible science of the canine nose, the emotional battle of a woman fighting for her life, and the reason why the medical community is now looking at our four-legged friends not just as companions, but as partners in the future of medicine. Because sometimes the hero doesn't wear a white lab coat and a stethoscope. Sometimes the hero has 4 legs, a wagging tail, and a nose that can smell the truth when no one else will listen. This is the story of Max. This is the story of the dog who saw the invisible. The air inside the county animal shelter always felt heavy. It wasn't just the smell, a sharp, stinging cocktail of industrial-grade bleach, wet concrete, and the lingering musk of 100 stressed animals. It was the weight of the silence between the barks. It was the heavy vibration of collective longing. People walked through those aisles looking for a spark, a wagging tail, or a high-energy greeting that promised a fun future. They looked for the movie dogs, the ones that jumped against the chain-link fences as if to say, "Pick me, I'm the one." Sarah was not looking for a movie dog. In fact, she wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. She had spent the last year of her life in a state of perpetual motion, career climbing, social obligations, and the frantic pace of modern city life. She felt hollowed out, a bit like the very building she was standing in. Her therapist had suggested a companion, something to anchor her to the present moment. So, on a drizzly Tuesday afternoon, Sarah found herself walking past rows of frantic barks and whimpers. Then she reached cage 42, while the dogs in 41 and 43 were spinning in circles and yapping at the sight of a human, the inhabitant of cage. 42 was still. He was a medium-sized mixed breed, part Labrador, perhaps part Shepherd, with a coat the colour of burnt toast and white paws that looked like mismatched socks. He wasn't standing. He wasn't begging. He was curled into a tight ball in the far corner of the concrete run, his head resting on his paws. "That's Max," a voice said. Sarah turned to see a young volunteer holding a clipboard. "He's been here the longest, nearly 6 months." "Why?" Sarah asked, her eyes returning to the still form in the corner. "He seems calm." The volunteer sighed, a sound of genuine exhaustion. "That's the problem. People don't want calm at a shelter. They want excited. They see his lack of energy as a lack of personality. Or worse, they think he's sick. We've had him checked out. He's healthy, just shut down. He's a rescue from a hoarding situation. I don't think he's ever really been the dog for someone. He's always just been one of many." Sarah felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. She knew what it felt like to be one of many, to be a face in a crowd, a cog in a machine, performing a role but never truly being seen. "Can I meet him?" she whispered. The volunteer unlocked the heavy gate. The metallic clack usually triggered a frenzy, but Max only lifted his head. His eyes were a deep, liquid amber, rimmed with a sadness that felt ancient. He didn't move toward her. He waited. Sarah stepped into the small enclosure and sat down directly on the cold concrete. She didn't reach for him. She didn't make high-pitched noises. She simply sat in his space and waited. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the distant chaos of the shelter. Then slowly, Max uncurled. He stood up on shaky legs, his tail giving a single, tentative thud against the floor. He walked over to Sarah with a slow, deliberate gait. He didn't lick her face or jump on her shoulders. He simply turned around and pressed his flank against her side, leaning his entire weight into her. It was a physical plea for connection. He wasn't asking for a toy or a treat. He was asking for a place to rest. In that moment, Sarah's fast-paced world stopped spinning. The deadlines, the stress, the noise, it all faded into the background. There was only the warmth of this discarded animal leaning against her. "I think he chose you," the volunteer said softly from the doorway. Sarah reached out and buried her fingers in Max's coarse fur. She felt a rhythmic thrumming, his heart beating against her leg. She didn't know then that this heart would eventually beat in sync with her own through the darkest nights of her life. She didn't know that the nose currently sniffing her sleeve was a biological marvel capable of detecting a microscopic threat growing inside her. She only knew that she couldn't leave him there. The paperwork felt like a blur. The "are you sure?" questions from the staff, the purchase of a flimsy nylon leash, the clinking of a new ID tag. When they walked out of the shelter doors and into the cool afternoon air, Max took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the world outside the cage for the first time in half a year. He looked up at Sarah, and for the first time, the sadness in his eyes was replaced by a flickering light of curiosity. "Let's go home, Max," she said. As she drove him to her apartment, Max sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing trees. He was quiet, observant, and intensely focused. Sarah thought she was the one doing the saving. She thought she was the hero of this story, the kind soul rescuing a dog no one wanted. She was wrong. She had just brought home a guardian, a sentinel, a creature whose loyalty would soon transcend the boundaries of companionship and enter the realm of the miraculous. The journey was beginning, and while Sarah was looking at the road ahead, Max was already beginning to study her, every breath, every scent, and every subtle change in her chemistry. The Savior had entered the house. He just hadn't revealed his mission yet. The first few months of Max's new life were a study in quiet adjustment. Sarah had prepared herself for the typical rescue dog challenges, chewed shoes, accidents on the rug, or perhaps late-night howling. But Max was an old soul in a sturdy body. He moved through her apartment like a ghost, his paws making soft thud-thud sounds on the hardwood floors. He seemed to appreciate the silence, the soft bed in the corner of the living room, and the steady reliability of a full food bowl. To Sarah, Max was the perfect roommate. He was there when she needed him, resting his heavy chin on her knee while she worked on her laptop, but he also knew how to give her space. Their bond was forged in the mundane, the 6 a.m. walks through the misty park, the shared glances over morning coffee, and the way Max would wait by the door exactly 5 minutes before she returned from the grocery store. But as the honeymoon phase of the adoption faded, a subtle shift occurred. It wasn't a sudden explosion of behavior. It was a slow, creeping obsession that began on a Tuesday evening in late October. Sarah was curled up on the sofa, a book in one hand and a glass of wine on the coffee table. Max, who usually occupied the rug at her feet, didn't lie down. He stood. His body was stiff, his ears slightly forward. He approached the sofa, and instead of resting his head on her lap, he focused his entire attention on her chest. He began to sniff, not the casual, curious sniff a dog gives to a crumb of food, but a deep, rhythmic inhalation. His nostrils flared, twitching with an intensity Sarah had never seen. He stayed there for a full minute, his nose pressed firmly against the left side of her ribs. "Max, what is it?" she laughed, nudging him away. "Did I spill something?" He backed away, but he didn't relax. He paced a small circle and then came right back, his amber eyes fixed on her with a look that was almost accusatory. He let out a low, huffing sound through his nose and nudged her again, harder this time, with his snout. At first, Sarah dismissed it. Dogs have quirks. Maybe her new laundry detergent smelled like something he remembered from his past. Maybe she had dropped a piece of popcorn down her shirt. She pushed him down gently, and eventually he retreated to his bed. But he didn't sleep. He sat upright, watching her through the shadows, his gaze never wavering from her torso. Over the next 2 weeks, the sniffing evolved into a ritual. Every time Sarah sat down, Max was there. The behavior was becoming more frantic, more desperate. He began to use his paws, large, heavy paws, to scratch gently at her chest, as if trying to dig something out. When she tried to move his feet, he would let out a sound that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a growl. It was a mournful, high-pitched whine that vibrated in his throat. "Max, stop, you're hurting me," Sarah snapped one evening after his claw caught the fabric of her sweater. The dog immediately backed off, his tail tucking between his legs, his head bowing in shame. But the moment she softened her expression, he was back, his nose vibrating against her skin. It was as if he were possessed by a singular, driving need to alert her to something. The atmosphere in the apartment changed. The peace they had built was replaced by a strange tension. Sarah found herself avoiding the sofa because she knew it would trigger Max's fixation. She started wearing thicker sweatshirts to create a barrier between her skin and his persistent nose. She began to wonder if Max was developing some kind of neurological issue. "Maybe the shelter life did more damage than I thought," she told a friend over the phone. "He's obsessed with me, not in a sweet way, in a nervous, frantic way. It's like he's smelling something that's bothering him, but there's nothing there." Her friend laughed. "He's a rescue, Sarah. He's probably just making sure his favorite person is still there. He's probably just scent marking you so he feels safe." Sarah wanted to believe that. She tried to tell herself that Max was just being a weird dog. But late at night, when the city was quiet, she would look down and find Max standing over her while she slept. He wouldn't be looking at her face. He would be hovering over her chest, his breathing heavy and synchronized with her own, his nose barely an inch from her body. He looked less like a pet and more like a scientist at a microscope, analyzing a sample he couldn't quite understand. One morning, Sarah woke up to find Max actually crying. He was sitting by the bed, his head resting on the mattress, making a soft, sobbing sound. When she reached out to pet him, he didn't wag his tail. He nudged her left side with his cold nose and looked her directly in the eyes. There was a clarity in his gaze that was terrifying, a look of profound, urgent communication. He was no longer just a dog no one wanted. He was a messenger. Sarah looked down at the area he was fixated on. She felt nothing, no pain, no lumps, no marks. To her, she was a healthy 34-year-old woman in the prime of her life. To Max, however, she was a house on fire, and he was the only one in the world who could smell the smoke. She decided then that she had to do something. Not because she felt sick, but because she couldn't stand the look of heartbreak in her dog's eyes. She would go to the doctor, get a clean bill of health, and then she would take Max to a behaviorist to fix whatever glitch was happening in his head. She didn't realize that the glitch was actually a biological siren, screaming at her to save herself while there was still time. The smell of a medical clinic is a universal constant, a sterile, sharp odor of isopropyl alcohol and floor wax that usually evokes a sense of order and safety. For Sarah, sitting in the small examination room, the environment felt grounding. It was the polar opposite of the chaotic, instinct-driven behavior Max had been displaying at home. Here, everything was measured, calibrated, and proven by science. When the nurse came in to take her vitals, Sarah felt a wave of embarrassment. How was she supposed to explain this? "My dog is acting weird" didn't exactly sound like a clinical symptom. "Blood pressure is 120/80. Perfect," the nurse said, scribbling on a tablet. "So what brings you in today, Sarah? Any pain? Lumps? Unusual fatigue?" "No," Sarah admitted, her voice trailing off. "Actually, I feel great. I'm here because of my dog." The nurse paused, her pen hovering over the screen. She offered a polite, professional smile, the kind reserved for people the staff might later describe as eccentric. "Your dog?" "I know it sounds crazy," Sarah said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "But he's been obsessed with my chest, the left side, specifically. He won't stop sniffing it. He paws at me, he whines all night. He's a rescue, and I thought it was behavioral, but he's so urgent about it. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something." The nurse nodded slowly. "Well, pets can be very sensitive to our moods. Stress, anxiety, they pick up on all of it. Let's see what Dr. Aris thinks." 10 minutes later, Dr. Aris walked in. He was a man in his late 50s with a reassuringly calm demeanor and a silver stethoscope draped around his neck like a medal of office. He went through the standard motions. He felt the lymph nodes in her neck, listened to her lungs, and performed a thorough physical palpation of her breast tissue. "I don't feel anything, Sarah," he said, stepping back and snapping off his latex gloves. "No masses, no irregularities, no skin changes. You're young, you have no family history, and your last blood work was exemplary." "But the dog," Sarah persisted, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "He's never been like this. It's like he's trying to tell me there's a fire behind a locked door." Dr. Aris sat down on his rolling stool. "Sarah, I've heard stories about miracle dogs. And it's true that some dogs are being trained to detect volatile organic compounds in lab settings. But in a home environment, there are too many variables. You might have changed your perfume. You might have a minor skin irritation you can't see. Or most likely, Max is sensing your anxiety about him, creating a feedback loop. He acts strange, you get worried. He senses your worry, and he acts stranger." He reached for his prescription pad, but instead of a drug, he wrote down the name of a local animal behaviorist. "My professional opinion, you are perfectly healthy. Go home, enjoy your dog, and maybe try some professional training for him. If you really want peace of mind, we can run a standard blood panel, but I suspect it will only confirm what I already know. You're fine." Sarah left the office feeling a strange mixture of relief and frustration. She wanted to believe the doctor. He had the degree, he had the equipment, he had the experience. Max had a wet nose and a history of eating garbage. When she walked through her front door that afternoon, Max was waiting. He didn't greet her with a wagging tail. He stood perfectly still, his nose already twitching. As she set her keys on the counter, he walked over and pressed his head firmly against the exact spot Dr. Aris had just examined. "Max, stop it," Sarah sighed, her voice weary. "The doctor said I'm fine. Do you hear me? I'm fine." She went about her evening, trying to force a sense of normalcy. She cooked dinner, watched a movie, and tried to ignore the shadow that followed her every move. But Max was different now. The whining had stopped, replaced by a grim, silent persistence. He wouldn't eat his dinner. He just sat by his bowl, staring at her, his eyes wide and dark. That night, the feedback loop Dr. Aris mentioned felt more like a haunting. Sarah tried to sleep, but Max began to do something he had never done before. He started to howl. It wasn't a loud, neighborhood-waking sound, but a low, mourning wail that started deep in his chest. It was the sound of a creature watching something slide off a cliff and being unable to reach out and grab it. Sarah sat up in the dark, her heart racing. She looked at Max. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, his body trembling. He looked exhausted, his ribs heaving with every breath. "What do you see?" she whispered into the dark. "Max, what do you know that they don't?" She reached down and touched the spot on her chest. To her fingers, it felt like smooth, healthy skin. There was no pain, no heat, no warning. But then she remembered something the shelter volunteer had said. "He's always just been one of many. I don't think he's ever really been the dog for someone." Max wasn't just a dog, he was her dog. And for the first time, Sarah realized that she was trusting a man who had seen her for 10 minutes over a creature who had studied her every breath for months. Dr. Aries was looking at data. Max was looking at her. The skepticism of the medical world had been loud, but the silence of her dog's heartbreak was louder. "Okay," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes as she pulled Max onto the bed. He immediately curled his body around her, his head resting right over her heart, finally falling into a fitful, exhausted sleep. "Okay, Max, I'll try again." She decided that morning she wouldn't settle for a physical exam. She would demand the tests that the doctors didn't think she needed. She would fight for a second opinion, not because she felt a lump, but because she couldn't live with the possibility that Max was right and everyone else was wrong. The lobby of the Women's Specialty Imaging Center felt different from the general practitioner's office. It was quieter, draped in soft pastel tones and the muted hum of high-end machinery. For Sarah, the calm was deceptive. Every minute spent in that plush chair felt like a betrayal of common sense. She felt like a hypochondriac, a woman driven to expensive medical procedures by a rescue dog with a sniffing habit. She had lied to get this appointment. She had told the receptionist she felt a vague heaviness and had a family history she didn't actually have. It was the only way to bypass the gatekeepers who insisted she was too young for advanced screening. "Sarah Miller?" a technician called. Sarah stood up, her legs feeling like lead. She had left Max at home, but his presence felt etched into her skin. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his nose against her ribs. The process was grueling. A mammogram, the cold metal, the agonizing pressure, followed by an ultrasound. The technician was a woman with a face like a stone wall, professional and unreadable. She moved the transducer over Sarah's skin, the blue gel cold and slippery. Sarah watched the monitor, seeing nothing but grey static and shifting shadows that looked like weather patterns on a distant planet. "The radiologist would like to take a few more images," the technician said, her voice neutral. That was the first crack in the "you're fine" narrative. A few more images. Sarah sat in a small sub-waiting room, wearing nothing but a thin paper gown. The air conditioning was biting. She began to shake, not from the cold, but from a sudden, paralyzing realization. If they found nothing, she was crazy. If they found something, her life, as she knew it, was over. 20 minutes later, she was ushered into a small office. A different doctor sat there, Dr. Vance. She didn't have the nothing-to-worry-about smile of the previous physician. She looked at Sarah with a focused, clinical intensity. "Sarah," Dr. Vance began, turning her computer monitor so Sarah could see the images. "I want to show you why we took the extra time." She pointed to a tiny, jagged shadow on the screen. It was so small it looked like a grain of sand, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding tissue. "This is a focal distortion," Dr. Vance explained. "It's less than 6 millimeters. In a standard physical exam, it would be impossible to feel. Even on a standard mammogram for someone with your tissue density, it's incredibly easy to miss, but the ultrasound picked up a vascularity, a blood supply that shouldn't be there." Sarah's breath hitched. "Is it? We did a core needle biopsy just now while you were on the table," the doctor said. "The preliminary pathology is back. It's a grade 2 invasive ductal carcinoma. It's cancer, Sarah." The word hit the room like a physical blow. The walls seemed to vibrate. The pastel colors turned grey. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs, but strangely, beneath the tidal wave of fear, there was a tiny, crystalline spark of vindication. "How?" Sarah whispered. "I'm 34. I feel fine. I run 3 miles a day. How could I have known?" Dr. Vance leaned forward. "That's the thing. Usually patients don't come in for this until it's much larger, until they can feel it or until it starts to cause pain. If you had waited another 6 months or even a year for a routine checkup, this would have been a very different conversation. This was caught at the earliest possible stage. Your prognosis is excellent because of that." The doctor paused, looking at Sarah's chart. "What made you come in? You mentioned a heaviness, but this tumor isn't large enough to cause that sensation." Sarah looked at the doctor, her eyes filling with tears. "My dog. He wouldn't leave it alone. He's been pawing at that exact spot for weeks. He wouldn't let me sleep. He wouldn't let me go a single hour without reminding me it was there." Dr. Vance went silent. She didn't laugh. She didn't offer a patronizing explanation about scent marking or anxiety loops. She simply looked at the scan and then back at Sarah. "I've heard of this," the doctor said softly. "It's rare, but it's documented. There are chemical changes, volatile organic compounds that malignant cells release. Most humans can't detect them until the disease has progressed. But a dog's nose is 1,000 times more sensitive than any machine we have in this building." She reached across the desk and placed a hand on Sarah's arm. "You need to go home and give that dog the biggest steak he's ever seen, because, Sarah, he just saved your life." Sarah walked out of the clinic into the bright, indifferent sunlight of the afternoon. The world looked different. The trees were greener, the sounds of traffic were louder, the air tasted sweeter. She was a cancer patient, yes. She had a long road of surgery and treatment ahead of her. But she was a cancer patient with a head start. When she pulled into her driveway, she saw Max's silhouette in the front window. He wasn't barking, he was just watching. She ran through the front door and collapsed onto the floor. Max didn't jump. He didn't lick her face. He walked over, let out a long, shuddering sigh, and rested his head on her shoulder. For the first time in weeks, his body wasn't trembling. The tension was gone. The mission was over. He knew that she finally knew. Sarah held him, burying her face in his toast-colored fur, sobbing into the neck of the dog no one wanted. He was the hero of a story she hadn't even known she was in. And as they sat there on the floor, the science and the miracle of it all began to sink in. Max hadn't just found a tumor. He had found her. While Sarah sat on her kitchen floor, clutching Max and reeling from the diagnosis, the world outside her apartment was beginning to wake up to a biological reality that had existed for millennia. To Sarah, Max's behavior felt like a miracle, a supernatural bond of love that transcended the physical. But to a growing community of oncologists, biologists, and chemists, what Max had done was purely, brilliantly mechanical. It was chemistry in its most raw and ancient form. To understand how Max saved Sarah, one must first understand that a dog does not see the world through its eyes. It smells the world in 4 dimensions. While a human being has roughly 6 million olfactory receptors in their nose, a dog like Max possesses up to 300 million. But it isn't just about the number of receptors, it's about the dedicated brain real estate. The part of a dog's brain that is devoted to analyzing smells is proportionally 40 times larger than ours. When Max pressed his nose against Sarah's chest, he wasn't just sniffing, He was utilizing a specialized organ called the Jacobson's organ, or the vomeronasal organ, located in the roof of his mouth. This organ allows dogs to taste scent molecules, bypassing the traditional nasal passage to send direct chemical signals to the brain. Every living cell in the human body is a tiny factory, constantly churning out metabolic waste. This waste is released into the blood and eventually exhaled through the breath or secreted through the skin in the form of volatile organic compounds, VOCs. Healthy cells produce a specific scent signature that remains constant. However, cancer cells are broken factories. Their metabolism is haywire, and as they multiply, they begin to pump out a unique cocktail of chemicals, alkanes and benzene derivatives that do not exist in a healthy body. To a human, these chemicals are odorless, especially when a tumor is only 6 millimeters wide, but to Max, those VOCs were a chemical scream. Scientists have compared a dog's olfactory sensitivity to detecting a single drop of blood in an Olympic-sized swimming pool or a single rotten apple in a warehouse filled with 2 million fresh ones. Max didn't need to see the tumor. He could smell the rot of the cancer cells long before they were large enough to be detected by human touch. What makes Max's story even more scientifically significant is that he was not a medical detection dog. In specialized labs around the world, dogs are trained using Pavlovian reinforcement to sit or bark when they smell a cancer sample in a petri dish. These dogs are professionals, often achieving accuracy rates of 97%, outperforming even the most advanced liquid chromatography machines. But Max was an untrained rescue. He had no reward system, no clicker training, and no treats. This suggests a deeper biological imperative. Scientists believe that because dogs have lived alongside humans for over 30,000 years, they have evolved to monitor our chemical baseline. To Max, Sarah was his pack, his source of survival, and his entire world. When her chemical signature shifted, when the scent of those malignant VOCs began to rise from her skin, it triggered a mismatch in his brain. It wasn't just that he could smell it, it was that the scent bothered him. It was a foreign invader in his home. His whining, his pawing, and his desperate nudging were the canine equivalent of an alarm bell. He was trying to groom the cancer away, or perhaps alert his pack leader that a predator had entered the camp. Sarah's experience is part of a growing body of evidence that is changing the face of oncology. Research centers are now attempting to build electronic noses, sensors that mimic the way a dog's olfactory bulb processes VOCs. Yet despite millions of dollars in funding, no machine has yet matched the sensitivity of a dog like Max. The reason is simple. A machine only looks for what it is programmed to find. A dog, however, looks for change. Max's miracle was actually a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. He was a biosensor with a soul. As Sarah prepared for the grueling months of treatment ahead, she wasn't just bringing a pet into her recovery, she was bringing the most sophisticated diagnostic tool on the planet. And as science would later prove, his role in her survival was only just beginning. The transition from healthy person to patient happened with a dizzying clinical speed. Within 10 days of her diagnosis, Sarah's calendar, once filled with marketing meetings and gym classes, was replaced by a rigid schedule of oncology consultations, portacath placement, and the heavy, looming presence of the infusion center. The world narrowed down to the sterile white walls of the hospital. But every time Sarah returned home, she was greeted by the one thing that hadn't changed: Max. However, Max's behavior had evolved once again. The frantic, desperate pawing that had characterized the weeks leading up to her diagnosis had vanished. It was as if Now that the secret was out and the fight had begun, he could put away the alarm and take up his post as a sentry. He moved from being the one who sounded the warning to the one who guarded the gate. As the chemotherapy began, the toll on Sarah's body was immediate. The Red Devil, the nickname for the potent, cherry-colored drug she was administered, brought with it a bone-deep exhaustion that Sarah had never experienced. It felt as if her very blood had been replaced with lead. During those dark weeks, Max became her constant shadow. He seemed to have an intuitive sense of her nadir, the period after chemo when her white blood cell count dropped to its lowest and her body was most vulnerable. On those days, he wouldn't leave the bedroom. He would position himself on the floor precisely where he could see both Sarah in the bed and the door to the hallway. He became a biological monitor for her side effects. On the days when her nausea was at its peak, Max would sit quietly by the bed, resting his chin on the mattress, offering a steady, grounding presence. He didn't ask for walks, he didn't beg for treats. He seemed to understand that the woman who had rescued him was now the one who needed to be carried. There was a new chemical landscape for Max to navigate. The scent of the tumor was now being mixed with the harsh, metallic scent of chemotherapy and the sweet, cloying odor of cellular death as the medicine did its work. While the medical staff tracked Sarah's progress through blood counts and vitals, Max tracked it through his nose. He would occasionally sniff the area of her portacath, his tail giving a low, slow wag, a sign of recognition perhaps that the invader he had detected was finally being engaged in battle. One of the most profound moments of their journey occurred during the 3rd week of treatment. Sarah had lost her hair, a milestone that felt like losing her identity. She sat on the bathroom floor, looking at the clumps of hair in her hands, feeling a wave of grief that no doctor could medicate. Max didn't see a patient or a victim. He walked into the bathroom, nudged her hands aside, and began to lick the top of her head. It was a gesture of profound acceptance. To him, she was still the woman who had knelt in front of his cage at the shelter. She was still his person. In the vacuum of her fear, Max's presence provided a bridge back to her humanity. As Sarah's physical strength waned, her connection to Max intensified. She began to notice things she had never seen before, the way his ears flicked toward her before she even spoke, or the way he would wake up from a deep sleep, the exact moment she began to feel a spike in fever. It wasn't just Sarah who noticed. Her home health nurse, a woman who had seen hundreds of patients, remarked on it during a routine check. "I've worked with service dogs before," the nurse said, watching Max watch her take Sarah's temperature. "But this is different. He's not following a command, he's following a heartbeat. He's synchronized with you." The fear was still there, of course. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the treatments failing, the fear of the future. But Max acted as a fear sponge. Science shows that petting a dog lowers cortisol levels and releases oxytocin, the love hormone, which actually aids in physical healing and immune response. Max was more than a pet. He was a therapeutic intervention. He was the anchor that kept Sarah from drifting away into the clinical coldness of her diagnosis. As the first phase of her treatment drew to a close, Sarah realized that while the doctors were saving her life, Max was saving her spirit. But the most emotional realization of all was still to come, a moment that would change how Sarah viewed her rescue dog forever. The chemotherapy had a way of stripping everything back to the bone. By the 4th month, Sarah felt like a ghost of her former self. Her skin was pale, her energy was non-existent, and the world felt like it was moving in slow motion while she was stuck in a thick, grey fog. It was a Tuesday night, the lowest point of her second-to-last cycle. The chemo brain was particularly heavy that day, a cognitive haze that made it hard to remember simple words or follow the plot of a television show. She was sitting on the floor of her living room, leaning against the sofa, because the walk to the bedroom felt like climbing a mountain. The apartment was dark, save for the blue glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Sarah began to cry. Not the loud, cathartic sob of a movie protagonist, but the quiet, hopeless leaking of tears that comes from utter exhaustion. She felt small, fragile, and terrified that despite the surgery and the poison in her veins, the fire Max had smelled was still burning somewhere deep inside her. Max, who had been resting in the kitchen, heard the change in her breathing. He didn't trot over, he walked with a slow, heavy dignity. He approached Sarah and sat directly in front of her, his eyes level with hers. For a long time, they just looked at each other. In the silence, Sarah realized that Max had lost weight too. His coat wasn't as shiny as it had been the day they'd left the shelter. He had taken on her stress, her illness, and her battle as if it were his own. Then Max did something he hadn't done since the day of her diagnosis. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. Then, very gently, he shifted his weight and pressed his nose against the left side of her chest, the site of the surgery, the site of the port, the site where the monster had lived. He didn't paw at her, he didn't whine. He simply held his nose there, breathing in deeply, and then he let out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to vibrate through Sarah's entire rib cage. In that moment, the fog in Sarah's mind cleared. She remembered the way Max had been in the shelter, the dog no one wanted because he was too quiet, too still. She realized that his stillness wasn't a lack of personality. It was a profound capacity for observation. He had spent his whole life waiting for someone to listen to him. He had spent months trying to save her life when she was too busy to notice, and he had spent the last several months guarding her while she was too sick to care. "You knew," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You knew before I did. You knew before the machines did. And you never gave up on me, even when I told you to stop." She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in the fur of his shoulder. She felt the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. It occurred to her then that if she had ignored him, if she had listened to the first doctor and dismissed Max as just a dog, she might not be sitting here. The tumor would have grown. It would have spread to her lymph nodes. By the time she felt it herself, it might have been too late. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She wasn't his savior. He was hers. The narrative of the rescue had been flipped on its head. She hadn't plucked a sad dog from a cage to give him a better life. He had been placed in that cage to wait for the person whose life he was destined to preserve. Every coincidence of their meeting felt in that moment like a calculated piece of a larger design. Max licked a tear off her cheek. It was a simple, canine gesture, but to Sarah it felt like a seal on a contract. They were no longer just owner and pet. They were a pack of two. They were survivors. As she finally found the strength to stand up and crawl into bed, Max followed her, jumping up and curling into the small of her back. For the first time since her diagnosis, Sarah didn't feel like a patient. She didn't feel like a victim of biology. She felt protected. She felt seen. She fell asleep to the sound of Max's rhythmic breathing, finally understanding that the most powerful medicine in the world didn't come in a syringe or a pill. It came with 4 legs, a wet nose, and a loyalty that didn't require a single word to be understood. The day Sarah rang the victory bell at the oncology center, The sound echoed through the sterile hallways like a clarion call. It was a tradition, a loud, metallic clang that signaled the end of active treatment. While other patients cheered and hugged their families, Sarah's eyes immediately went to the waiting room door. Because of hospital regulations, Max couldn't be by the bell, but he was waiting just beyond the glass, his tail thumping against the floor the moment he saw her emerge. Sarah was officially in remission. The fire was out. But as the weeks passed and her strength returned, Sarah realized she couldn't simply go back to her old life. She couldn't return to the marketing meetings and the superficial stresses of her previous existence, as if Max hadn't fundamentally rewired her understanding of the world. She felt a profound sense of debt, not just to Max, but to the thousands of people who might be sitting in doctors' offices at that very moment being told they were fine while their pets knew otherwise. Sarah began to document her story. What started as a small blog post for friends and family quickly went viral. People from across the globe began reaching out with similar accounts. A cat that wouldn't stop needing a specific spot on its owner's abdomen, a golden retriever that began barking at a mole on its owner's leg that turned out to be melanoma. Sarah realized that Max wasn't an anomaly. He was an ambassador for a neglected field of medical science. She began partnering with non-profits dedicated to training medical detection dogs. She visited research facilities where dogs were being taught to sniff out everything from Parkinson's disease to malaria and COVID-19. She saw firsthand the rigor of the training, the double-blind studies where dogs walked past rows of canisters, identifying the one containing a single cancerous cell among hundreds of healthy ones. One of the most rewarding parts of her mission was returning to the office of Dr. Aris, the first doctor who had dismissed her concerns. She didn't go back to gloat, she went back to educate. She brought her test results, her pathology reports, and she brought Max. "I'm not here to tell you that you're a bad doctor," Sarah told him as Max sat calmly at her feet. "I'm here to ask you to listen differently. When a patient says their pet is acting strange, don't just dismiss it as anxiety. View it as a symptom. View the animal as a highly calibrated diagnostic tool that has been observing the patient 24 hours a day." Dr. Aris was silent for a long time, looking from the medical charts to the toast-colored dog. He admitted that since Sarah's case, he had begun asking his patients about their pets during routine checkups. It was a small change, but it was the beginning of a shift in medical culture, a bridge being built between high-tech medicine and ancient biological instinct. Sarah started a foundation named Max's Mission. The goal was twofold: to fund research into electronic noses based on canine biology, and to encourage the adoption of shelter dogs by highlighting their extraordinary capabilities. She wanted the world to see that the unwanted dogs in the corners of shelters weren't just pets, they were potential lifesavers. Max became the face of the foundation. He visited hospitals and schools, his calm presence a testament to the power of the human-animal bond. He was no longer just a rescue, he was a celebrity, a symbol of hope and a living reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated technology in the world is covered in fur and fueled by love. But for Sarah, the most important part of the mission happened every morning. When she woke up, she would look at Max, and he would give her a quick, routine sniff. It wasn't the frantic, desperate behavior of the past. It was a check-in, a thumbs-up from his nose. All clear, his wagging tail seemed to say. Sarah had been given a second chance at life, and she was determined to use every breath of it to ensure that the silent language of animals was finally heard. She had learned that survival isn't just about medicine, it's about connection. It's about paying attention to the things that don't speak but have everything to say. If you were to see Max today walking through a sun-drenched park or napping in a patch of light on Sarah's rug, you wouldn't see a medical miracle. You would see a dog. You would see the grey hairs beginning to frost his muzzle, and the way he still sighs with contentment when he finds a particularly soft spot to rest. Max doesn't know he's a hero. He doesn't know that his story has been shared in medical journals or that he changed the way a city of doctors views the animal kingdom. To Max there was no mission. There was only the woman who had knelt in the dirt of a shelter and seen him when no one else would. This story is more than a tribute to one extraordinary dog. It is a reminder of the invisible language that surrounds us every day. We live in a world of data, screens, and cold clinical facts. We have become so reliant on what we can prove with a machine that we have forgotten how to listen to what we can feel with our hearts. Max didn't need a medical degree to know Sarah was in trouble. He didn't need a biopsy to understand that her scent had changed from life to threat. He simply stayed present. In a world that is constantly distracted, a dog's greatest gift is its absolute presence. They are the ultimate observers of our lives. They know our routines, they know our moods, and as science has now proven, they know our very chemistry. We must also look at where this story began, in a cage. Every year, millions of dogs like Max sit in shelters, labeled as unwanted, too quiet, or plain. We often walk past them looking for a specific breed or a certain look. But Max is living proof that value is often hidden in the places we refuse to look. The very qualities that made him unadoptable to some, his stillness, his intensity, his watchful nature, were the very qualities that allowed him to save a life. When we rescue an animal, we think we are the ones showing mercy. We think we are the ones providing a service. But the truth is a circle. We give them a home, and in return they give us a perspective that no human can provide. They offer us a connection to a more intuitive, primal way of being. They remind us that we are part of nature, not separate from it. So, what does this mean for you? It doesn't mean that every time your dog sniffs you, you should rush to the emergency room. But it does mean that we should start paying closer attention to the anomalies in our pet's behavior. When a cat that is usually aloof becomes suddenly clingy, or a dog that is usually playful becomes focused on a specific part of your body, don't dismiss it as a quirk. Science is finally catching up to what pet owners have known for centuries. Animals are tuned into a frequency we simply cannot hear. They are the sentinels at the gates of our health. Sarah and Max still walk in the park every morning. Sarah is healthy, her hair has grown back, and the shadow of the red devil has faded into a memory. But she never takes a single breath for granted. Every time she looks at Max, she sees the bridge between life and death. She sees the creature who stood in the gap when the rest of the world told her she was fine. Sometimes the hero doesn't wear a lab coat. Sometimes the hero doesn't have a voice to speak your name. Sometimes the hero is a brown dog with mismatched white paws and a nose that can smell the truth. Max never understood cancer. He only understood love. And in the end, perhaps those two things, instinct and love, are the most powerful diagnostic tools we will ever have. As you go about your day, look at the animals in your life. Really look at them. They are watching you. They are listening to you. And if you're lucky, they might just be the ones who know you better than you know yourself.